Let's go straight into our next session, which will be focused on regulatory considerations for AI in healthcare. And so I'd like to introduce our moderator for this session, who is Dr. David Larson, who's a professor of pediatric radiology and vice chair for education and clinical operations at Stanford. Welcome, David.
Thank you so much, Serena. Hello, everyone. It's really great to be with you all. What a fantastic conference that we've had so far. I'm extremely excited about this topic on regulatory considerations for AI in healthcare. It's one of my favorite topics for AI in medicine, as it's evolving so rapidly and has such significant implications for our field. We have three excellent speakers and panelists today, Drs. Khair, ElZarrad, Russell Stewart, and Hugh Harvey. They'll each share their presentation, and then we'll open it up for a panel discussion at the end like we've done up to now. And I'll go ahead and give an introduction to for each of the speakers just before they speak. A number of questions have already come up in the chat, which is great. If you have additional questions, please continue to submit those or upvote other questions, and we'll do our best to get to at least a few of them during the discussion. I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing the topic because I want to save as much time for the speakers and for the discussion as possible, so we'll dive right in. Let's get to our headline speaker for this event, Dr. Khair ElZarrad, who's the Deputy Director of the Office of Medical Policy, or the OMP, at the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, where he leads the development, coordination, and implementation of medical policy programs and strategic initiatives. Prior to joining the FDA, he served as Acting Director of the Clinical and Healthcare Research Policy Division with the Office of Science Policy at the NIH. And he earned his doctoral degree in medical sciences from the University of South Alabama and a master's degree in public health from Johns Hopkins University. Dr. ElZarrad.
Hi, thank you so much, and wonderful meeting. I really appreciated everything that's been said so far, and appreciate making this proceeding available to everybody afterward. I think we have a lot to learn from what's been said already, so I appreciate that. I'm sharing my slide with you in a second here. So, as David mentioned, I'm with the Office of Medical Policy at the Center for Drugs. So I'm coming to you a little bit from a different perspective than probably what you heard from the device perspective. But I want to highlight how many overlaps we have and how many shared challenges and opportunities across the board. My office deals quite a bit also with anticipating what's coming from a regulatory perspective, technology-wise, and ask key questions such as, are our regulations and regulatory frameworks in general ready to handle such innovation that we're seeing? We're interested, of course, in the safety, but also we're interested in making sure that promising therapeutics come as fast as possible to those who needs it. With that said, in the title you see the word exponential technologies, I want to illustrate that what we're seeing right now is really a convergence of multiple advances in multiple areas. And I hope you'll take that from my talk. It's not just one area, it's everything coming together, I think, and it will have the promise to have an exponential growth and advancements for therapeutic development and for medical device development as well. So with that said, for today, I just want to highlight the evolving ecosystem, just something to give you an idea of what's in the back of our mind as we work into this area as regulators. The need for innovation, which is, I hope I can make that case specifically when it comes to clinical trials. And then I want to discuss with you briefly the FDA real-world evidence program, which I think it highlights a lot of the shared challenges that we have here when it comes to the training data sets, when it comes to validations of what we're seeing in front of us as potential therapeutics. And from there, I will, focus a little bit more on AI, and I hope, to hear what your perspective on that as well. So from the evolving ecosystem is not just, again, one area. We're seeing an advancement in the evidence generation paradigm. We're seeing that multiple sources of data potentially can be utilized to help us get evidence that we can base science-based regulatory decisions on. The real-world evidence program, for the FDA is an example of that, and I'm going to touch on it. But also we're seeing an increasingly digitization across the board. And it's not just limited to the most obvious tools and devices, but it really comes across the board. We're seeing that in the consumer product, of course, and also in the algorithms that seem beneath all of, to make all this function. Also, I want to touch on the innovative clinical trial designs. And I feel like this is really a key area that could help the community at large move forward if we do better when it comes to the design and conduct of clinical trials. All of this, of course, is not exclusive. It's just a very connected ecosystem that we're very conscious of. And we need to look at it, I think, as a connected development. So you hear me talking a lot about randomized clinical trials. It's, a lot of you probably can educate us on this, but just briefly, I think the power of randomized clinical trials is that you can pre-specify the criteria of how you're going to conduct your trial. You can pre-specify who's going to be, the population is going to be involved, your inclusion, exclusion criteria, your arms, etc. But also the power of randomization. I think it's a key thing here because it allows us to distribute, as all of you know, both known and unknown biases. And I think that's really a very interesting strength here that we need to keep in mind as we move potentially into other modalities of different types of study. And we're going to keep that in mind in moving forward. So with that in mind, just to go, since this is a policy talk focused, on what constitutes substantial evidence, the evidence that we rely on to make decisions for the effectiveness. This is actually part of the legal and regulatory paradigms that we have. And as you see here, the substantial evidence typically is interpreted as 2 adequate and well-controlled trials, but could also be met using single trial plus confirmatory evidence. And I think the plus confirmatory evidence here, it allows us to think about different streams of evidence and data sets that could supplement and provide evidence in this case. So all of you are familiar, I know this image is probably overused multiple times, but you're familiar with how long it takes for a therapeutic development to happen. When you start, for example, with thousands, tens of thousands sometimes of promising therapeutic compounds, you end up with one after 10 to 15 years. So the length, the time that takes, it's a really a substantial issue here to think about. And how can we do better? This is actually came from an ASPE study that looked at the cost of the clinical development. And as you can see here, they have the therapeutic area, the cost per therapeutic area. It can be in the hundreds of $millions, and consider this is just the clinical part of the development. So obviously we need innovations. We need to do better here. And we can talk probably a whole talk on how technology can help us do better here. The other thing I want to highlight before I move forward from this slide is that a lot of clinical trials fail because of reasons, frankly, simple reasons like lack of recruitment, failing to recruit enough numbers of patients. Basic elements of design sometimes can result in the failure of a clinical trial. So it behooves us to really understand how can we do better. So I think this is the framers of the developers of the 21st Century Cures Act want us to kind of think about what other streams of data can be utilized for us in our regulatory decision making. For example, how to utilize what we call real world data, real world evidence, and we're going to define those terms moving, in the next couple of slides. Data generated outside of clinical trials for approval of a new indication of drugs that are already approved and are on the market, and how to satisfy post-approval study requirements. Certain drugs we need to collect additional information on safety and efficacy after they enter the market, and potentially real-world data from practice, for example, can supplement us in that area. So this program was based on a framework that was issued in December 2018. I believe the link is down below. And then it describes the priority areas and the remaining challenges and potential pilots that can help us understand the area a little bit more. We're required also as an agency to produce a draft guidance on real world evidence by the end of 2021. So that's the paradigm we're working under right now. So what do we mean by real world data? Real world data can be coming to us in multiple different sources. For example, as you see in front of you, pharmacy dispensations, insurance claims, EHR is one of the most famous ones, lab results, registries, and hospital records. And we define that as data relating to patient health status and or the delivery of healthcare routinely collected from a variety of sources. So keep in mind that these processes, the collection of this data, the capture, the analysis of this data can be also augmented, guided, and facilitated by technology, including, of course, AI. And we're going to touch on that. I want to make the distinction between data and evidence. And I think from a regulatory perspective, that's really an important distinction to make. A lot of these data sources are unstructured, not clean. They might not make sense, seeing them even as large as they are, for evidence generation. So how to make sense of this data, how to use this data to develop evidence. This is where I think a lot of areas such as the study designs, for example, observational studies, randomized clinical trials, and also the associated analytical tools and the informatics, AI, cloud-based systems, and linkages can help us and make sense of this data to provide evidence. And this is why the definition of real-world evidence is the clinical evidence regarding the usage and potential benefits or risks of the medical product derived from the analysis of real-world data. this is where you actually can base your decisions on. So that's kind of the paradigm we're working on around real-world evidence. And again, the real-world evidence program publication, it's available for you. It details all of this. One of the biggest problems, of course, when you deal with real-world data, as a lot of you experienced and actually expressed in your talks, is that in real world, nothing happens at the right place at the right time. And that's actually a challenge, as you can imagine, when you think of therapeutic tools in general, utilizing this data and structured data to make sense of it. Let's take EHR, for an example. We know 96% of hospitals now utilizing EHR, which is great. However, the different types of proprietary EHR systems, you have over 700 vendors. Routinely then talk to one another. The critical or time-sensitive information routinely gets buried in endless scrolls of data. Not to mention, of course, the burden that was touched on by Dr. Tobal and others on the healthcare providers by maintaining and utilizing the systems. It's funny when you hear the word electronic, I always kind of associate it with the flexibility, with something that's with value added. I think it's a little bit of a misnomer using the term electronic in describing the health record systems that we have right now. And I think we should see more and more kind of development and innovations around that. So the struggle is how to make sense of this unstructured data in different types of systems, how to link different systems that are not interoperable, and how to identify and manage bias in this system, identifying missing data, and also how to detect trend that's meaningful within those large data sets. As you can see, this is all really shared struggles across the board, regardless of paradigm you're working on, AI, devices, drugs, etc. We're seeing some really promising areas where AI start help us in determining the accuracy, the structure, the cleanliness of the data, and how to make sense of it. And not just for EHR, for claims and other tools as well. And just here's a couple of examples where actually I thought there's interesting blogs and papers where that discussion happened and how can we really utilize AI to help this area move forward. So when you talk about large data sets, and I just want to show you a challenge that we kind of struggle with when it comes to registry. So unlike prospective randomized clinical trials, when you look at data sets and try to base a study on a registry, for example, this is a study that looked at the use of oral bisphosphonate to see if there is any kind of association with esophageal gastric cancer. And in this case, it did not find any significant association with esophageal gastric cancer. It utilized the UK General Practice Research Database. However, in the kind of almost the same time frame, here's another study that found that the risk of esophageal cancer increased with 10 or more prescriptions for oral bisphosphonate and with the prescriptions over about a 5 years period. Mind you, this is similar time frame, similar drug, and similar the same database. So you have the same data source, similar time frame, and same drugs, and looking at the same outcome, but they delivered opposing results. And the question for us is why? And keep this in mind, when we think about different training data sets or different data sets that utilize to, for example, determining if a device works. So with that, also, we have to ask the questions as a regulator, what would transparency and documentation look like for observational studies or for observational data in general? For clinical trials, we have clinicaltrials.gov. We have the prospective approach of having your protocol reviewed and approved prior to conducting the study. What does that really mean here, when you start utilizing retrospective data sets? And I think this is why, again, Dr. Tobal highlighted the importance of prospective design. So I don't want to miss the promise of how AI and technology can help us when it comes to clinical trial designs, because I think we have to look at the low-hanging fruit when we have issues we know of when it comes to clinical trials. So for example, decentralized clinical trials, I believe, is a very interesting and promising platform that can help us advance the field by bringing clinical trials to homes or local clinics, for example. Not everything lends themselves to that, as you see in the diagram in front of you. However, a lot of trials can be done. Think about, for example, dermatology trials of looking for acne or psoriatic plaque, for example. Those can be utilized, done using phones, using iPads and beyond. So there are some really interesting examples of those. And here are just a couple of examples of companies that looking at this model by shipping the phones to the patients and utilizing the cameras to capture images of how a compound or therapeutic compound function. Also, we're seeing a lot of interesting innovations in this area, which, for example, for adherence within a clinical trial. How to make sure that the patients enrolled are taking the drug and taking it in a timely fashion, adhering to it, the regimen. I think there are some really interesting innovation there that could actually transform this field for us and help us as a community. So in the FDA, we're very aware that this is happening, and we want to be a part of the facilitation of this kind of new tools. The FDA My Studies app is an example of that, where provide actually it allows for the flow of data in a secure environment. Think about it, how to utilize this app, for example, in a clinical trial setting to allow for data capture and data flow. This app is actually being explored currently for the use in informed consent process for COVID patients, where face-to-face informed consent process might not be possible. And FDA also, I believe, for a while now, are aware and trying to be responsive for the digitization that we're seeing around us. Here are just a sample of guidances where it highlight the electronic source data, the electronic informed consent, electronic records and electronic signatures, and the use of EHR. And of course, one of, I think, my colleagues at Center for Devices, I thought it was really interesting how they published this discussion paper around the regulatory framework for modification of artificial intelligence and machine learning. So Dr. Tobel and a lot of you mentioned how this is really a across-the-board transformation. And I think this is something we're very aware of. We're seeing it as coming to us from multiple directions, and we have to be prepared to make sure we understand it. All the way, for informed consent, for example, virtual reality, we're seeing it as a very promising tool. We're seeing the telehealth approach. A lot of you might be familiar with Abilify MySight, the first chip that had the first pill that has a computer chip inside of it, as an example for tracking what we might see, or for adherence that we might see in the future. Of course, many of you are aware of Apple Health Kit. I mentioned the example for adherence in clinical trials. Sensors, for example, when you think of sensors, I think there are a variety of sensors that should be considered, and not just the typical sensors that you would think of in a normal settings. Also, passive sensing is another area where you don't even have to have something on the body of the patient or the clinical trial participants. That can be something on the room wall, for example, detecting their movement. And I know this is a busy slide, but I just want to highlight to you something that's been said to me a couple of years ago at actually a pharma meeting, when one of the CEOs said, if you're a pharmaceutical company and you're not aware yet that you should be a technology company, you're not paying attention. So this is the field that we're all paying attention to it, and the convergence of those powerful technologies across the board of drugs and devices. So moving a little bit into AI, and this is mentioned, that we're seeing kind of the sharp increase in the number of studies utilizing AI, one form or another. And we asked the question, is this really materializing into clinical research? This data from PubMed to data in clinicaltrials.gov. Of course, the scale is very, very different, as you can see here. And this is data from January 2020. And that doesn't really vouch for the quality of those studies. And I think it behooves us to think a little bit more about how to understand this field moving forward. We're seeing multiple promising areas around the use of AI, for example, early drug development and clinical development, and also for the post-market. Now, a lot of them are more promising than others, and I want to highlight that at the end, how to make sure we cut through the hype. But here are just a few examples of those. For us, understanding the complexity as a regulator, I think it's a critical challenge. This is actually a paper in New York Times that's doesn't have to do anything with health. It's actually about costumes, Halloween costumes, but they describe a couple of scenarios on how AI was given task, for example, to sort list of numbers, only at the end sorting a list of numbers while also minimizing the chances of errors. And it ended up deleting the whole list because that's the way to minimize errors. I know my time is almost up, so I'm gonna move a little bit faster. I'm going to move actually to this slide and then my closing slide. I want to highlight the benchmarking issue, that it's a struggle across the board for regulators, and all the issues that could involve in it, and how can we collectively as a community work on benchmarking. An example of that, the work of the AI for Health group on radiology benchmarking and the human interface. And I want to maybe in the Q&A expand on that. The regulation, transparency, and documentations, and sorry, I'm moving a little bit fast because of the time. I want to highlight how the data can be utilized from real-world performance into the regulation and into understanding how something performs. I want to highlight the transparency aspect in the work of the Consort and Spirit team, where you actually publish, when you publish, what areas you have to report on around AI. And then from there to my last slide, I would like to contemplate with all of you what functions lend themselves to AI adoptions, as we heard this morning, quite a bit of promise there. An example of key regulatory considerations, understanding the full context and the human factor in that, and what should be the standard for transparency and documentation. What are the best benchmarking approaches? And also, can the current regulatory framework handle these innovations? Can our processes handle this innovations? And how can we be responsive? Attracting the right talent and how we can modify our work processes is another challenge. And I want to ask all of us, are we ready from an ethical perspective? Are the IRBs and DSMBs ready, informed consent-wise, data privacy? And finally, how best to develop new norms, shared understanding, and ultimately standards for all of us to move forward and advance this field. And with that, I want to stop and thank my colleagues who actually do a lot of the work that I presented on, my boss and the rest of the team here. And thank you so much. I'll stop sharing right now.
Thank you so much, Khair. That was great. I think on that last slide, we've got all the questions teed up for our discussion section. So thank you for getting us started. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Russell Stewart, who is a practicing radiologist, as well as the Vice President of Clinical Affairs at Nines Incorporated, a startup radiology machine learning company headquartered right here in Palo Alto. Dr. Stewart earned his bachelor's and master's in biological sciences from Stanford and his MD from the University of Chicago. Came back and trained with us and was on faculty for a while. Actually worked very closely with me as the Director of Quality Management for the Department of Radiology at Stanford while he was with us full time, but he still practices with us on a part-time basis in addition to his role at Nines. So we're very happy to have him with us today. His presentation is entitled Regulation and Therapeutic Development in the Age of Exponential Technologies. Russell.
David, thank you very much. Great to see you again virtually. Let me share my screen here. My title here is Regulatory Considerations for Radiology AI Startup. I'd like to talk briefly about our company Nines and the process that we went through for our regulatory approval. Again, I'd like to briefly just touch on our FDA approval process and then start reflecting on our lessons learned, and then talk about how our company looks ahead at ML model development. Before I get going too far, I'd like people to know that this was me before the regulatory process. I am a radiologist. I had no formal legal or regulatory background. And this was me after the regulatory process. No hair, and that beard is white. It's not even gray, it's a white beard. In all seriousness, no, I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to lead a team at Nines, incredibly talented folks who also didn't have a regulatory background and helped push this product across the finish line. What is Nines briefly? Nines is a cloud-based radiology practice that is bringing together incredibly talented radiologists, data scientists, and engineers with the goals of accelerating the development, implementation, and utilization of advanced technology and AI to improve radiologists' work experience, the satisfaction of referring providers, and the delivery of quality patient care. Our first approval was for a computer-aided detection triage device. At its time, it was the first of its kind approval for 2 indications, intracranial hemorrhage and mass effect on a non-contrast head CT. It was a pre-market clearance 510K. People who have tuned into this talk, there's probably a large group of you who are very familiar with this type of model. It allows for the model to run in the background on images that have not been viewed by a radiologist yet, and alert the radiologist for the possible presence of emergent findings on the scan and allow the radiologist to prioritize their work list accordingly. Our clearance was efficient and it took a long time. From concept to minimum viable product was actually not the longest amount of time that was spent, but actually moving that product to device approval and eventual planned deployment. The challenge is trying to get the best sensitivity and specificity for the clinical indication, understanding the deployment nuances, how to integrate, and what are the regulatory requirements. Our learning here is focused on building something that you want to deploy. Again, the important things here are how do you integrate into the current workflows? How's your model going to be displayed? How is it going to directly or indirectly affect patient care? How do you navigate the existing software applications? How is it going to be integrated with the expert? And how do you gather the radiologist or expert feedback and potentially iterate on your product? In addition to time, the clearance requires a lot of resources. Great things were accomplished by our team. And I think the important challenge here to highlight is that we are trying to build something that has to be concrete and unchanging to go through a regulatory body that is constantly evolving its thinking with technology. Some of our learnings, I think it's important to look at your model through the lens of global health. You might have a model that improves radiology or expert efficiency, but you may indirectly expose the patient to greater safety concerns. The ever-present question or importance of data and generalizability, not only for the patient data, the demographics of the patient data that you're training on, and is it, does it meet your intended use population, but also the models that you develop on the technology and the software and the hardware, the scanners and the models generalizable to the intended population you plan to deploy your model at. As I mentioned before, budgeting time, it takes a lot of time, and it's important to reflect in the process. Take time to pause during your sprints to reflect and incorporate the feedback of what you've learned, what works and what doesn't work as you move forward. Considering a regulatory expert, either internal or external, could be helpful. And again, highlighting, don't do the minimum that is needed. It's important to have a firm understanding of the comprehensive factors that contribute to the best possible product. If you have a great ML model, how do you capture all the value and the power of the ML? Technology needs to be clinically useful. Who is benefiting? Is it reducing costs? Is it making the radiologist more efficient? Is it a safer read for patients? It has to be effective. Is it helping the radiologist provide better care, picking up missed malignancies? Or are you running the risk of generating a model that's performing a routine diagnosis or function that may be even subpar to a human? It won't work autonomously, and it may make the user or the expert less efficient. And then, as I mentioned before, the most important factor is that focus on patient care. What are the unintended consequences? Looking at the example of a computer-aided detection triage algorithm, does it have a high sensitivity and a low specificity where you run the risk of having alarm fatigue for the user or delaying the interpretation of cases that are not covered by your model? You often see, or I always see that in the news, someone's developed a model and they've made claims that, it's going to replace an expert or a radiologist. A much smaller population of these models make it through the regulatory approval, and then people figure out how to deploy it and then fully understand the clinical benefit. I think a better way of looking at it is to focus on a specific real clinical problem, understand the benefit and how to deploy that model, and then understand the regulatory pathway and then begin working on the models. At Nines, we prioritize a roadmap based on what we can and need to deploy. The blue circle here is supposed to represent all the opportunities for improvement in healthcare. The red sliver is supposed to represent radiology. Some people might argue that red sliver should be much larger. Looking at the value chain of radiology, there's many places where ML can be applied, but it's important to focus on a specific real world problem. And then we like to prioritize based on what we can deploy. And then we look at, the regulatory status. Is it regulated or not regulated? And then we look at how long it takes. Healthcare moves slowly. Startups like to move fast. There's certain things that have probably a good clinical impact, but simply have too much of a cost from time perspective to get approved. So we really focus on things that are regulated that take 1 to 3 years to get approved, and also non-regulated models that we can deploy quickly. We rank our roadmap there based off clinical impact and ease of build from that. Our takeaways here are technology can empower radiologists. It definitely requires collaboration with the end users and the experts and the FDA, which is a great partner. And we'll always invest in models that support our mission and vision. The graph on the right is supposed to depict how we view our practice performance. It says efficiency, quality, and safety on the y-axis, but how we believe our practice can evolve over time. The blue line is how we feel we're constantly improving things through technology that's not regulated or simple workflow development. And the red lines are supposed to represent FDA approvals of models, which can have a much bigger impact or a step change in the performance of the practice, but come at much less frequent intervals. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Russell. It's great to see you, great to hear from you. I have to say, I barely recognized you without those flowing locks of hair you had before you went through the regulatory approval process. So, but the beard's coming in nicely.
Thank you, David.
We miss your quality improvement work here, but you're glad to see you're applying it in effective ways. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Hugh Harvey, who's a consultant radiologist and the managing director at Hardian Health. He's also an academic trained at the Institute of Cancer Research in the National Health Service. He's held lead roles at 2 flagship UK startups and now serves as board advisor to many AI startup companies across the globe, as well as an honorary research fellowship at the Institute of Cognitive Neurosciences at UCL. Dr. Harvey's presentation is entitled Intention versus Claims, How to Please the Regulators. Hugh.
Hello, hi there. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to take part in this symposium. I'm aware I've got 7 minutes, so we'll get straight into it. I'd just like to note that clearly there's a pattern here that regulation causes baldness. I'm also a radiologist, and I've got devices regulated before, so it clearly makes people lose their hair. So in order to sell AI, as you probably guessed by now, you need FDA approval if you're in America, but obviously in the rest of the world, there's other regulatory pathways. So in Europe, for instance, we have the CE marking process. It's fairly simple in America. If you're a vendor, you deal directly with the FDA, and they are the only central governing body who can regulate medical devices. In Europe, the regulatory infrastructure is perhaps slightly more convoluted in that the vendors have to hire independent third-party notified bodies who then go to a European bloc governance organization. So in the UK, we have the MHRA, and then they all conform to the European medical device regulations. It's important to note that this doesn't just apply to countries within Europe. There's also some member states who are sort of geographically just outside Europe that it applies to. And there are many other countries around the world who don't have their own independent regulatory structures that will accept the CE marking from Europe. So what is the definition of medical device software, or otherwise known as MDSW? Some people call it software as a medical device, which is SAMD. This is the FDA definition. So medical device software is software that is obviously a machine intended for use, and I'm going to get into this intended use statement, in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, which is why we're doing AI in radiology mainly. It can be involved in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. But for the purposes of this talk, and because most of us here are radiologists talking about this, we'll talk about disease diagnosis. The EU definition is pretty much the same. The wording is just slightly altered. It is software that is intended to be used alone or in combination for a purpose as specified in this paragraph here. So again, software is included, and if it's for diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, prediction, prognosis, or treatment, alleviation of a disease. There's a couple more extra nuances to it as well. But by and large, the definitions of medical device are the same in Europe and America, and you'll note that they both rely on what your intended use is. And for me, now I consult globally for regulatory pathways for startups. We always start with what's known as the intended use. What is an intended use? This is quite a sort of a misunderstood term generally by startups. They think the intended use is to diagnose cancer or something like that, but it's not. The intended use is a very specific phrasing, and it's has to be very well defined. And words matter. When you're writing down your intended use specification or statement, you have to be really super specific about what you say your intended use is. And the words that you use in your intended use statement have to reflect what you're saying to everybody else. So in all your labeling claims, your advertising materials, anything you say, giving a speech, a lecture, any written statements you make, this might be online or in pamphlets or in brochures, or if indeed you knowingly offer your system for use for a purpose which was not labeled or advertised, these all count as your intended use. And if the FDA or your European regulatory bodies catch you putting anything that wasn't in your intended use statement out publicly, then you can be fined, or you can even have your device withdrawn from market. And we've all heard of Theranos and how that fell about in the end. It was all down to them claiming it to be able to do things that it could not do. So they were claiming a false intended use that had never been approved by the FDA. The department really in your organization or startup who should be dealing with this in a pharma company is typically known as the medical affairs department. And there are trained clinicians trained in the profession of medical affairs who understand what language they can and can't use when providing advertising materials or labeling claims. The same goes for startups because we're still going through some of the same conformity pathways. So it's very important to understand that. The intended use encompasses the indications for use. So the intended use is your general purpose of the device and clarifying, possible misuse scenarios. But the indications for use are the specific things. What disease is it? What patients do you want to use it on? What qualifications does the end user have to have? What environment do you want to use it in? And the intended use then allows the regulators to assess what risk class of device you are. So if you say, I intend it to prevent cancer in stage 3 melanoma, you might be quite a high risk device. If you say, well, I only intend it to give a potential flag to a highly trained person under given scenarios, you will lower your risk. So the wording of your intended use statement, it really, really reflects on your risk class. And the higher up the risk class categories you are, the longer it takes you to actually get to market and the more proof and evidence you have to supply. So a little test. Here's an actual intended use statement pulled off a 510K approval from the FDA database. I've altered this so it's missing something. So what we can see is that this intended use statement has included what modality it's for. It said it's for trained radiologists, so we know what the qualifications of the end user should be. We know what pathology it's looking for. We know what clinical setting it's looking for. It's in. They've said it's not intended to be used as a diagnostic device, so they've clarified the possible misuse. They've classified what the outputs are, but something is missing. They haven't defined what kind of patients it's on. Is this adult patients? Is it pediatric? Have they only tested it on female patients in their training data set? So it's important that they have to be able to identify that. And for certain diseases where ethnicity is a factor in the prevalence in the population, that also needs to be taken into account. Again, this is one from a successful CE marking application. And again, I've altered it so it's missing something. And what we can see here is they've defined the adult population. So we assume here that they've included both genders. And they haven't said exactly what age, but I give them credit where they're probably assuming this is over 18 years old. They've said the modality, they've said the pathology, pleural effusion, they've given the outputs, they've said where it's going to be, what clinical environment, and they've classified here this whole paragraph on the possible misuse. It's not intended to be used on a standalone basis for clinical decision-making, etc. But what they've missed out is who's actually going to use the device. They haven't said anywhere that this is going to be used by qualified radiologists. So you have to be very careful with your intended use statements. And what you've noticed for both of these examples is these use statements are incredibly short. And that's because words matter. And the more you waffle on, the more you could get yourself into trouble about making inadvertent claims. So you must work with a regulatory expert, either internal or external consultant, to help you define your intended use. Obviously, as your company progresses, you may want to improve your product. And over time, that actually might change the intended use. And the FDA has released these 4 levels of specificity which trigger a change in your intended use. So you might be introducing a new physical parameter that's being measured, or a different population, or maybe a new anatomical location. You might move from MR of the brain to MR of the spine, for instance. You might be moving from a diagnostic to a screening setting, or you might be having a new effect on a clinical outcome. So any of these could potentially change your intended use. So when you're planning out your product roadmap, it's important to know when your intended use changes, because then you need to do a new application. So that's very important as well. This is my final slide, because I know I'm coming up to time. It's my belief that algorithms are the new drugs. After all, they are regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, and they have to go through a series of clinical trials, and they have to go through regulatory approval, just like drugs do. Well, I also think that they should come with leaflets, just like drugs do in their packets. And I really recommend you reading this paper, which is published in Nature Digital Medicine, called Presenting Machine Learning Model Information to Clinical End Users with a Model Facts label. And I think this kind of label should be on every website of every vendor who has regulatory approval. So we know exactly what they said to the regulators in terms of their intended use, their performance, their uses, their warnings, etc. Because I think it should be just as transparent as when you take a packet of pills. And that is the end. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Hugh. That was great. Okay, let's dive right into the discussion. We have just a few minutes. I'm going to address my questions to individuals, but others on the panel, feel free to also weigh in as long as you promise to keep your thoughts and your comments short and pithy. We want this to be a dynamic dialogue, so don't be shy. First question, this actually comes from the chat from Tandra Sayeda Mahmood. We'll address this to Khair. The question is, will regulated models in the future be allowed to adapt and train on site at a deployment institution to deal with model generalization issues? And maybe I could add to that, unlike drugs, algorithms can be continuously changed over time. So clinical trials are often thought of in the construct of a therapeutic agent, but is that even the right model to think of this rapidly evolving model?
Yeah, this is actually a very interesting questions, and I typically also receive the questions is about the validation approach, or what kind of parameters or metrics would you want to use for AI tools and devices in general. And the answer to that is going to have to be specific to the tool. And as Hugh mentioned, the context of use in general, the intended use is really critical here. I would say the premise of the question is not really would FDA accept or not accept. I think this is a clearly evolving area, and I think as collectively we have to come to an understanding of what constitutes a process that validates this tool, that makes sure they can enter the market in a way that we're all comfortable with. I think the collaboration that's happening right now around regulatory considerations with the ITU and WHO is an example of that. And I'm hoping we can get there to get that standardized to a certain level at least.
Great, thank you, Khair. Russell, do you have any thoughts on that from a developer perspective?
I think that Khair did a great job of highlighting. We usually defer to the FDA on what process needs to be in place in order to get a model approved. I don't want to speak over him. I think he did a great job of summarizing.
Great. Okay, thank you. Okay, next question. Another one that came from the chat. This came from David Granger and asked, we'll direct this to Hugh, by the way. Should regulators require that AI manufacturers provide, quote, model facts labels with their medical device products in line with the Nature Digital Medicine article from the Duke Group? So I don't know if you've seen that. The authors argue that model developers should provide information specifically for frontline clinicians on how, when not to incorporate the model into your clinical decisions. Sounds right up the line with what you're saying, but maybe even going a step further. What do you think?
Yes, I would absolutely agree with that. I think we need better transparency and we need less hype. I think we just need to be honest that these startups are entering a highly regulated health and life critical industry, and they just need to be completely open and transparent with what they've produced and the level of evidence they've provided. And I think, for buyers who are looking at buying an algorithm, it's very difficult to sort out the wheat from the chaff at the moment. And I think having some kind of standardized labeling that everybody agrees is an industry standard of the way to present what your model does, I think would be hugely beneficial. And I'm aware that the UK, the MHRA, who's our regulatory body, are considering this now as a mandatory thing if you want to enter the UK market. So highly agree. And the paper is, as I stated, in Nature Digital Medicine, highly recommended to read. Great.
Thank you. Hugh, actually, I'm going to have another question for you, but I'd love to hear other people's thoughts. Backing this up a little bit more, we've heard this debate out kind of in the community about what standards that AI algorithms should be held to in general. Should it be simply human level performance, or should it be higher, or should it be much higher? And then how should this be incorporated into the regulations?
It completely depends what the intended use is. So if you take drugs, for instance, some drugs are super efficacious and others aren't. They're only used for fourth line refractory chemotherapy, and they very rarely work, etc. So I think it depends exactly what your intended use is and what diseases, disease states, and disease time course you're intending it to be used on.
Go ahead. I'm going to push you more on that. All right. So we have a radiologist, and they can do it. We have a group of radiologists, and they can provide the interpretation. Now I've got a model that comes out, and we look at that and say it can do just as well as the radiologist. Is that good enough, or do we need to say no? That model needs to be held to a higher standard.
Again, it depends on the intended use. I mean, is the model intending to replace a function of what the radiologist does? In that case, it probably should be held to a higher standard. But if it's only intended to flag things that the radiologist would never look at or are very bad at looking at, then maybe not. So I would defer again to the intended use.
Got it. Okay, so it's the outcome of what is the total environment that it's put into, not just the application itself.
Yeah, I would think that's reasonable.
Great, thanks. Any other thoughts from the other panelists?
Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead, Russell. You start.
Sorry.
Khair, yeah, go ahead.
Hugh did a great point this out. I think it depends. Is the model supposed to work alongside an expert or a radiologist? It's supposed to augment their workflow, empower them, and help them out. In the medical decision making, still relied upon the radiologist or the expert making that opinion, or is it functioning autonomously? I think it's quite difficult to say. A model has been trained on all the data necessary to function autonomously. I mean, you and I know that. And radiologists here know that we all have our weaknesses and our weak spot, and we may miss one thing that someone someone else might not miss. So you run a risk of letting an algorithm go, saying that it functions as well as whatever radiologist it's being compared to. I think that's a big leap that hasn't been made yet.
Great, thank you. And speaking of autonomous AI, that's been a topic of a lot of discussion recently. And so what I'm hearing you say, Russell, is that's a different kettle of fish than an algorithm that's there to augment. If this thing's working on its own, then that thing's got to be really reliable.
Correct.
Great. Okay, Khair?
I just want to add, again, I think everybody's touched on the context. The context really matter, and that will also help us understand the risks and benefits. But the concept of seeing how an algorithm functions in real world, and the potential for that to feed back into how we can modify and update, I think it's an interesting concept by itself that CDRH, Center for Devices, actually outlined a little bit in their framework, and it's worthy of a discussion. Thinking about all the real world data and how we're going to utilize it moving forward in the future.
Okay, great, thank you. Maybe this one I'll have Khair start on this. Again, another high-level question. What do you see in general as the role of the regulators regarding algorithm performance? Is it to set the bare minimum of safety and performance standards so that can then enter the marketplace? Or should it be structured in a way that really drives world-class performance at every installed site? And then I'll follow up and say, if it is just mainly the minimum threshold, then what would be the mechanism that would drive that race to the top, so to speak?
Well, I would answer by saying I think there is a role for regulators, and I think historically we've been seen a little bit as a barrier, and I tend to disagree with that. I feel like we're part of the quality continuum, and I think we should be part of the process, an integrated part of the process that allow us to actually facilitate and actually ensure that whatever the product is ultimately something responsive to the patient needs, and the community at large. So I think we have multi aspects, multi-function here that we all should play. To give you one example, the level of engagement we've been going through is like we're trying to engage at early development points. We send people to some of our staff to CES, for example, to start engaging with the technologists and understanding how those tools can be developed and how can we be ready for those tools. We want to be responsive to this. So I think we hold multiple buckets here, and we have to really function at all those cross spectrum in a way.
Great, thank you. Other thoughts, either of our other panelists on that?
I concur.
Excellent. Doctor. Great, thank you. Okay, why don't we do, we'll throw a question at Russell. How much can we, who now are in practice, rely on the vendors under regulatory oversight for the performance of local performance of algorithms, so these local algorithms that are installed? Will it still require a fair amount of our local quality control and monitor, or is it plug and play?
I think it's the responsibility of the medical professionals, if you're planning on deploying a product in your institution or your practice, to understand the best of your knowledge, how the model works, what are the intended or unintended consequences, and the safety of the model. I think it's ultimately going to fall back on the medical professionals.
Great. Okay, well, with that, we'll end the session. Excellent work, all of you. Thank you so much for sharing. This was really a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.